The whole private dining room went quiet the second Sandra said my daughter's name like it belonged to someone important. "Do you know what her company's doing now?" she said, beaming at me like she was handing me a gift. I stood there in my good dress at my own 35th anniversary dinner, champagne going warm in my hand, and understood that my daughter had just let a stranger humiliate me in front of 30 relatives on purpose without ever raising her voice. My name is Carol. I am 69 years old, a grandmother, and I want to tell you my side of this because my daughter Paige has apparently been telling hers to anyone who will listen for years now, and somehow, in her version, I'm the villain of a story where I gave up my own comfort trying to hold a family together. Welcome to Grandma Never Forgets. I know how this is supposed to go. I know you're expecting the sweet grandmother who finally gets to tell the truth after everyone wronged her. I'm not entirely sure that's the woman you're going to get tonight, and I'd rather tell it honestly than pretend otherwise. I grew up the way a lot of women my age did, watching my own mother, Adeline, run our household like an accountant with a grudge, doling out affection in careful, measured amounts, depending on who she decided deserved it that week. My older brother got the car, the tuition, the benefit of every doubt. I got a part-time job at 15 and a mother who told me more than once that I'd simply have to be resourceful, since resourceful was apparently a compliment when it was aimed at the child receiving less. I told myself, raising my own 2 children, that I'd never play favorites the way she had. I believed that about myself for a long time, right up until I found myself, decades later, sitting at my own kitchen table, using almost exactly her logic on my own daughter, dressed up in slightly kinder words. I've thought about that a great deal this past year, the way a pattern can travel through a family for 2 generations without anyone ever deciding on purpose to carry it forward. I don't offer that as an excuse. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy for me to tell you my mother made me this way and let that be the end of the conversation. I don't think it's the end of the conversation. I think it's simply the beginning of understanding where the habit came from, which isn't the same thing as being forgiven for keeping it going. Bryce was the kind of child who needed you. Paige was the kind of child who didn't seem to, and I want you to understand how those 2 things pull on a mother in very different directions. Bryce came to me with problems, with plans, with a need in his voice that made me feel like a mother is supposed to feel, useful, essential. Paige came to me with report cards and closed doors. She managed herself so completely so early that some part of me, I'll admit now, stopped feeling needed by her at all. And a mother who doesn't feel needed starts without quite deciding to, looking elsewhere for the feeling. When Bryce came to us 18 years into building his business, panicked, telling us the company was 1 bad month from collapsing, my husband Ray and I made a decision I still believe, most days, was the only real decision available to us. There was a fund, money my own mother Adeline had set aside years before she died, meant for Paige's college. It was sitting there, untouched, earning nothing, while my son's entire livelihood, everything he'd built since he was 26 years old, hung by a thread. Bryce needed a bridge. His business mattered more in that specific moment than a dorm room Paige could have found another way to afford. I said those words to her at our kitchen table, and I have heard secondhand how they sound played back all these years later. I still don't fully believe I was wrong to think them, even if I've come to understand I should never have said them quite so plainly to an 18-year-old's face. I want to be honest about the week that followed, because Paige tells it like I sat there smug and satisfied while she packed her boxes. That isn't how I remember it. I remember feeling sick most of that week, catching myself rehearsing justifications in the shower, in the car, anywhere I was alone, Megan, my daughter-in-law, was the one who found the right words that day at the kitchen table, or the words that felt right at the time. "This is what good families do," she said. "We carry each other." I latched onto that sentence like a woman grabbing a railing because it let me believe for a little while longer that what we'd done to Paige was generosity rather than theft. I've had a long time since to sit with which one it actually was, and I still, to be honest with you, haven't fully landed on an answer I'm proud of. Paige left within the week, and I want to correct something she's apparently told people. That I stood in the doorway smugly telling her she'd regret throwing away the family. I did say something like that. I remember it differently than cruelty, though I understand it landed as cruelty. I was frightened. My 18-year-old daughter was loading a stranger's hatchback with everything she owned, and the only tool I had in that moment was the same tool my own mother Adeline had always used on me, guilt dressed up as concern. I reached for it because it was the only language I knew for fear. The years after that were harder on me than I think Paige ever gave me credit for, though I recognized the unfairness of asking for credit from a daughter I'd sent away with nothing. I called, I texted, every message I sent got read. I know that now, and mostly ignored, and I told myself each time that I was simply trying to hold the family together, that a good mother keeps reaching even when a child won't reach back. I see now some nights that what I was actually doing was trying to reel her back into being useful to Bryce again, without ever quite admitting that to myself. I don't think I was lying to her exactly. I think I was lying to myself so thoroughly that whatever I told her came out sounding like the truth. There was a particular Thanksgiving, 4 or 5 years into her absence, when I sat at a table with an empty chair where she used to sit and told the assembled relatives that Paige simply couldn't handle being close to the family right now, that she needed her space, that we were respecting it. Rachel, my niece, was young enough then that she believed me, and I remember feeling a small, ugly satisfaction at how easily the story held together once enough people were willing to repeat it. It took Rachel years to learn a different version, and I understand now that every year she believed mine was a year I'd successfully rewritten what actually happened in that kitchen, at least for the people who weren't in the room for it. Megan called me often during those years too, always circling the same theme, wondering aloud whether there was anything more we could do to bring Paige back into the fold. And I let those conversations comfort me more than I probably should have, because they let me imagine myself as a woman working tirelessly to repair a rift rather than a woman who had caused one and was now simply managing the optics of it. Bryce's company folded a year after we gave him that money. I want you to sit with that the way I've had to. Every dollar of my daughter's education gone, and it changed nothing, bought him 12 more months of a business that collapsed anyway. I remember the phone call where he told us, his voice thin and apologetic, and I remember my very first thought, before grief, before worry, was a strange, cold flash of the number, the exact figure that had come out of Paige's fund, running through my head like a receipt I couldn't put down. I didn't say that number out loud to anyone. I've carried it privately for 13 years. Ray and I did the only thing we knew how to do when that happened, which was double down. We took a second mortgage against the house, the same house Ray had spent 30 years paying off, to help Bryce start again, and I remember signing those papers at the kitchen table with a strange, hollow calm, the calm of a woman who has already crossed one line and no longer entirely trusts herself to feel the next one as clearly. I understand. Watching it laid out plainly like that, exactly how it looks. I want to tell you it felt different from the inside, less like doubling down on a bad bet and more like refusing to let our son fall, but I've stopped being entirely sure there's a real difference between those two things, and I think some part of me knew that even as I was signing, my own mother Adeline had died a few years before all of this, and I found out much later, secondhand through my niece Rachel, that she'd left Paige a tin box hidden in her belongings, cash she'd saved quietly over years, along with a note telling my daughter to build something we couldn't take. I want to tell you honestly what I felt reading that detail for the first time. It wasn't gratitude toward my mother for looking after my daughter. It was something closer to betrayal, my own mother, going around me, distrusting my judgment about my own children enough to hide money from me specifically. I've turned that reaction over many times since because I understand it says something unflattering about me, that my first response to my daughter being protected was resentment rather than relief. I'm telling you anyway because I promised myself, sitting down to tell this story, that I'd tell the true version and not the flattering one. Word started reaching us slowly the way it does in a small county that Paige was doing well somewhere in Columbus, some kind of online business. I didn't know the size of it. None of us did. I told people when it came up that she had a little online thing because that was the size I'd allowed myself to imagine. A hobby, not a life she'd built entirely without us. I understand now that I minimized it on purpose because the alternative, imagining my daughter thriving completely independent of everything we'd taken from her, was harder to sit with than picturing her scraping by and eventually needing to come home. Bryce started a second company a few years later. And by then, I think both Ray and I understood, somewhere underneath what we let ourselves admit out loud, that stopping would have meant confessing the first company had cost us our daughter for nothing. So we kept believing in him, because believing in Bryce was the only thing that made the earlier decision survivable. The second business started struggling the same way the first one had, and the house, still tangled up in that old loan guarantee, was at risk all over again. I knew. Planning our 35th anniversary dinner, exactly what I wanted out of that evening, though I'd have told you at the time it was simply a celebration. I invited the whole family. I sent Paige a card myself, and I'll admit, because I promised honesty, that Megan and I discussed beforehand how a public setting, a happy occasion, warm and full of witnesses, might make it easier for Paige to say yes to helping her brother than a private conversation would. I don't think that makes me a monster. I think it makes me a mother who had run out of private ways to ask and reached for a public one instead. I understand that from Paige's side, it must have looked like an ambush. I'm not certain even now that I'd call it something else. The dinner went exactly as planned, right up until it didn't. Ray gave his toast, worked the conversation toward Bryce's new venture the way we'd discussed, careful and warm, the kind of toast that makes everyone reach for their glasses without quite noticing they're being maneuvered. I watched the relatives nodding along, watched Bryce doing his best impression of a man on the verge of a comeback, and I felt for a few minutes genuinely hopeful that the evening might go exactly the way I'd planned it in my head for weeks. I stood up and said the words I'd rehearsed in the mirror that morning, more than once, until they sounded natural instead of scripted. Be proud of supporting the family, sweetheart, I told her, in front of everyone, and I meant it in that moment, as tenderness, as an invitation back into something I still believed she secretly missed. I still don't fully understand why a room full of people heard it as something closer to a demand, though I've had a year now to consider that perhaps I knew exactly how it would land and simply chose not to examine that too closely at the time. Then Sandra opened her mouth, this woman none of us had ever met, and told the whole table about panels and speaking engagements and a company that apparently employed dozens of people, and I felt the floor of that beautiful evening simply give out from under me. I hadn't known. I want to be honest and say that the humiliation I felt in that moment was not primarily about Paige. It was about every relative in that room suddenly understanding that we had asked our extremely successful daughter for money in the same breath we'd been quietly starving her out of this family for 13 years, and that she had let us walk into that room not knowing, had let Sandra be the one to say it instead of softening it for us herself. I watched 30 faces rearrange themselves around a new understanding of who I actually was, and I want to tell you that is a particular kind of exposure I hadn't experienced since I was a much younger woman. The sensation of an entire room recalculating you in real time. Ray's hand found mine under the table, cold, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that we should have asked her privately after all, not because it would have changed what we'd done, but because it would have let us keep controlling how the doing of it looked to everyone else. That, I think, tells you something true about me that I'm not especially proud of. Paige stood up then and said her piece, calmly, the way she does everything, laying out the whole history in front of everyone. The kitchen table, the fund, the sentence I'd said to her at 18 that apparently she has never once stopped hearing. I won't pretend she was inaccurate. I will tell you that hearing your own life recited back to you as evidence in front of your entire family on your anniversary does not feel like justice, even when every word of it is true. It feels like being erased and replaced with a version of yourself you don't fully recognize, even if you can't quite argue it's wrong. Bryce did what Bryce does when he's cornered, which is get loud, and I watched my son shout at the sister who just declined to save him a second time. And some small, quiet part of me, a part I don't examine too closely most days, thought, not for the first time, that a company that needed saving twice by two different women it had never once repaid might not have been the future worth investing in that we'd told ourselves it was. Paige left that dinner without raising her voice once, wished us a happy anniversary on her way out, and I have not been able to fully explain to myself or to anyone why that composure hurt worse than shouting would have. Bryce's second company folded within the year anyway, exactly like the first one. And this time there was no fun left anywhere in this family to soften the landing. He sold his house. He works for someone else now, which I understand, from what little he tells me, has actually been good for him, though I mostly hear about his life secondhand these days, too. The same way I hear about Paige's. I have one grandchild now, Bryce's daughter, who visits on holidays and calls me Grandma Carol in a voice that's still a little formal, a little careful, the way children are with relatives they haven't quite decided to trust yet. I don't have any grandchildren from Paige. I don't know that I ever will. I think about that more than I let on to anyone, including myself, most days. I don't call Paige much anymore. When I do, she's polite, brief, useless to me in the way I imagine she's decided to be on purpose, giving me nothing I could ever spin into a story where she needed us again. I've told myself many versions of what happened between us over the years, and I'll admit to you now, at 69, that I still believe most of them at least a little, even the ones I know don't hold up entirely under the facts sitting right in front of me. I think about my own mother, Adeline, more than I expected to, this past year. The accountant with a grudge who apparently, in her own quiet way, decided to protect the granddaughter she must have suspected I wouldn't protect myself. I resented that discovery when I first heard about the tin box. I resent it somewhat less now, though I notice I still haven't managed to feel simple gratitude toward a woman who saw more clearly than I did, in my own kitchen, exactly what I was capable of doing to my own child. I wonder sometimes whether Adeline ever felt what I feel now, watching a daughter build a whole separate life specifically so her mother's decisions could never reach it again. I never got to ask her. I'm not sure, even if I could. that I'd have liked the answer. I don't have a lesson to hand you at the end of this, the way these stories usually go. I'm not going to tell you. I finally understood everything. Anne called my daughter crying and got invited back to the family she built. That isn't what happened. What happened is I said a true thing about my son's business mattering more 13 years ago at a kitchen table. And I have spent every year since mostly trying to prove to myself it wasn't as unforgivable as it apparently sounded. And some nights I nearly convince myself, and other nights, if I'm honest with you, I don't. If you've ever sat across from a parent who couldn't quite find their way to actually saying, sorry, only around it, I'm not going to tell you what you owe them. I don't think that's mine to decide for you any more than it was ever really mine to decide what I owed my own daughter. Drop a comment and tell me honestly whether you think a mother like me deserves a second chance, or whether some things once said out loud at a kitchen table simply can't be taken back no matter how many years you spend wishing they could. Subscribe to Grandma Never Forgets, and I will see you in the next one.